super crazy and up in the air, and you're a very busy person, and but we're really excited to have this conversation with you. Um, why don't you start? I guess let's just start informally. Let's just
Sure.
tell me a little bit like what you're up to these days. What's quarantine life like?
It's busy, but it's not as busy as I expected. And part of that is simply because of the way that schedules, worked out, secondary to basically my entire state shutting down. So I live in Los Angeles, and as do you, right? You live in
Yeah,
LA.
yeah. I'm
Yeah.
in Pasadena, just up the road.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm in Eagle Rock, so I'm very close to you.
Okay.
And of course, we have some, not just in California, but also in LA, in some ways, have some of the stricter shelter at home or shelter in place orders in the US. So we haven't opened back up really at all yet.
Right.
Um, and because a big part of my income is in television production, of course, Hollywood is basically at a standstill. So the idea was that I was gonna start filming back on one of the TV shows that I work on Brain Games, this summer. So I actually took my, summer semester off from my PhD program, and, 'cause it's, like, nearly impossible to see patients, work on my dissertation, take courses, and film a TV show.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I've done it, and that's how I
Yeah.
know. So I decided to take a leave during the summer session, and then all of this happened. So not only am I not in school right now, and legally I'm not really allowed to do anything for school right now, as far as my professional liability insurance is concerned, so I can't see
Mm.
clients. We're also not filming yet, so we're like in a holding pattern, waiting until we start filming, which of course means come fall, I'll probably be doing all of it at the same time again. But in a way, I'm kind of treating quarantine life as a little bit of like a self-care vacation. I mean, I'm still podcasting, I'm still, doing meetings and things like that. But there are definitely way more days than I generally have where my schedule is light. And that's kind of amazing because it's allowing me to meditate a lot. It's allowing me to spend some time like watching documentaries, bonding with my dog. I'm doing like lots of arts and crafts. So
I've taken
we're-
up baking sourdough bread.
yeah, oh, you're one of them.
Well, I
It's
didn't.
like a
Yeah,
new.
I am. I am one of them, but I didn't even realize I was one of them until it had happened. Like my neighbor said she got some starter, and I'm like, "Ooh, I want some." And then some people told me you're one of them, and I'm like, "Them? Like, what's the?" And
Uh-huh.
then I realized it was a craze. So, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
have
it's been fun.
lots and lots of friends who are in your bread cult. I've actually been like, I will have no problem. I've determined I'll be like the queen of the nursing home. I'll be rocking the arts and crafts room when I get up there in age because I'm, subscribe to all these craft boxes, and every few days I'm learning a new skill. I'm pouring resin, or I'm embossing, or I'm, embroidering. So
That's
I'm
amazing.
feeling good. Like I can make stuff that's pretty.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's therapeutic, right? I mean, that seems.
Absolutely. It's very
Yeah,
meditative. I also, have found myself coloring, something I never did in the past.
I've heard that
Um,
that's very calming.
yeah, I don't know if it is when you are, I mean, maybe it is for some people, but I'll tell you, I've never done it previously because I've always been overwhelmed with my schedule and, stressed about juggling a million things. And so, although probably the do as I say, not as I do person in me would say, sit down, color, take a
Right.
minute, just like be in the zone. I could probably never have done it before. But right now, it's actually really therapeutic for me.
Well, we've talked about this topic and sort of titled it "Staring into the Void," which is super inspiring,
Mhm.
super uplifting concept.
Mhm.
But I think we're all sort of like relate to that notion of the sense of, oh crap, I'm mortal. What does my life mean? And I actually first, I guess, started talking to you about this about a year ago when we chatted a little bit about your new PhD program that you're working in.
Yeah,
And so tell us a little bit about that. Like, where are you studying? What's it about? And just kind of the overview.
absolutely. So, just to, I guess, to take a few steps back, my original undergraduate degree was in psychology. I studied psych way back in 2004 when I got my undergrad degree, but I was also a philosophy minor. And then I completely switched gear. Well, I shouldn't say completely, but I kind of switched gears and I went into the biology department. And,
Mm.
I did most of my real kind of serious academic work in neurobiology. So I worked in a wet lab where we cultured nerve cells in vitro, and wrote my master's thesis there. Went on, started a PhD, ultimately dropped out. But that was in also a wet lab where I was doing some research on uh, regeneration in nerve cells, specifically in birds. We were looking at birds make new neurons throughout the lifespan, especially songbirds, because they learn new seasonal songs, some of them, certain species. So we were studying how they do it and how come we can't, except in very specific areas. Um,
Hmm.
and then I went into psychom. So I've been in psychom for 10 years, completely out of academia, except for the ties that I've maintained in an effort to interview, a lot of great scientists for TV shows, for podcasts, for things like that. Um, I think deep down, there was always a part of me that said, I really love being a professor. I love teaching. I had been doing it as an adjunct for a long time while I was getting my master's, and then after, because I kind of stayed on. Um, and I think there's a part of me that always had that kind of life goal. But of course, I was making decent money, and I was enjoying my time in psychom. So there was still something that was missing. And ultimately, there's certain things that I wanted to be able to do that I would never be able to do unless I'd finished a PhD, because unfortunately, that's how certain fields work. And I decided to finally go back. I think one of the real determining factors for me was that I had struggled with financial aid, and I had struggled with debt for so long, and I was finally debt free. I shouldn't say debt free, free of bad debt.
Right.
Still have good debt, if you want to call it that, like a mortgage. Because like nobody in the world is, well, that's not true. Very small percentage of people are free of all debt. But I determined that I didn't want to take out any more student loans. So I waited until I was in a financial position where I could pay for school out of pocket
Mm.
slowly. And that's why I'm now 36 years old and I'm a PhD student. And there are a lot of other PhD students who are in their mid to late 30s and their 40s and even their 60s and their 70s, and they all have their own path and their own life story. But this one is mine. So I
Yeah.
started, 3 years ago. I went back to school at Fielding Graduate University, which is a professional school. So they only offer degrees in psychology. They do offer different types of psychology degree, and it's only a graduate school. So some
Right.
masters, mostly PhDs. They don't do PsyDs, so it's a research and clinical program. All the degrees are research degrees like media psych and other areas, except for there is a clinical program, and that's the program I'm in.
Mm.
So I have the added um, requirement of doing a bunch of hours of practicum, seeing patients for 1,500 hours plus. And
Wow.
then after that, before I can graduate, once I've defended my dissertation, once I've done all my coursework, once I've finished that, I still have to do a 1 year pre-doctoral internship. So that's just like a full-time, standard 8-hour day, 1 year internship. And it's a match program similar to medical school. So that is down the line. I'll be applying not this year. Yeah, I'll be applying in 2021 for that. So I'd be doing it in 2022. And then hopefully I'll
All
graduate
right.
after that. We'll
And then
see.
start a practice, I presume, of like seeing clients, seeing patients.
Yeah, I mean, I could. You still have to do a postdoc. You don't have to do in California. The
Oh
licensing
man.
laws are different than in certain, different states have different laws. In California, you don't have to do a classical, like it doesn't have to be designated a postdoc, so it doesn't have to be at a university or really big clinic, a hospital, anything like that. You just have to have a certain number of postdoctoral hours,
Mm, hmm.
and before you can't get your license until you do that. So you're going to be practicing on a on a supervisor's license. And that's why if you've ever gone to therapy and you've noticed that it's really confusing seeing everybody's different titles, and this doesn't include MFTs, MSWs, all of the titles for master's level therapists, counselors, things like that. But at the PhD and PsyD level, sometimes you'll see licensed psychologist and sometimes you'll just see psychologist. Psychologist probably hasn't finished all of those requirements yet, so they're still utilizing somebody else's license, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in California, where we both are, even the term psychologist for yourself is a protected class.
Yeah, but that's not the case. You're right. In some states, you can be a master's level psychologist. But in California, there are no master's level psychologists. You are a therapist or you're a counselor. If you're a psychologist, you have either a PsyD or a PhD. It's the only
And a licensure too, right?
And a license. Yeah. You can be a psychologist who's not licensed.
I see.
Because, for example, a psych professor, who's teaching social psychology, probably, they're not clinical.
Right.
And you can be also pre-licensed, so working on those things, but it won't say licensed psychologist, right? It'll say, psychologist or doctor so and so. But you'll see it'll either say licensed psychologist or it'll have the letters afterward of the board. If you're working with a therapist who has gone through all of that. And of course you can look up licensure online and you can see the status of somebody's license. You can see if it's ever been on pause. So yeah, that's important too.
Revoked or on pause.
Yeah. So that's farther down the line. And who knows if I will do a private practice, if I will work for a hospital for oncology, or if I'll wait a while if I'm still working in science communication, because ultimately here's the real weird thing: I make more money in psychom than I will as a psychologist.
Right.
And that's mostly in the TV landscape. It's not from podcasting, although that contributes. But TV is really, really, really feast and famine. You never know if you're going to get another gig. The sad truth is, in the American landscape, being a woman on camera, I'm like ancient by regular TV rules, which is bananas.
Absurd.
I know, it's absurd. And so you never know. It's a hard truth. It's really messed up. I'm always pushing back against it, but ultimately it is what it is. And I have to be prepared for that as well. But of course, psychology was always a deep love of mine. And we can get into why I didn't ultimately go neuropsych, why I chose to go clinical instead, why I'm focused in existential psychology, and specifically in social justice and diversity as well.
Yeah, let's go there. Let's talk about existential psych and what it is, kind of the abstract sized explanation of what is it, and why this approach for you.
Right. So I think one of the best ways to understand existential psych is to also understand it in context of some of the other orientations. So at my university, everybody who goes through the clinical program gets a PhD in clinical psychology. That's the degree. We have concentrations that are offered, like early infant development, forensic psychology, neuropsychology. Some of those things offer board certification, like neuropsychology. My concentration is in social justice and diversity. So I tend to look at things through that lens, and I tend to take more courses in those fields. So things like sexual and gendered violence, or, race relations, multicultural psychology, things like that. So that is an area of interest. Now, there's also something called like an orientation in psychology, and that's really, how do I approach the questions of why people come to therapy, and how do I approach my treatment in therapy. And most of us have probably heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's mostly because that's what managed care tends to cover. There are some universities that only teach CBT. So you don't have a choice. Like if you go there, you're going to become a CBT practitioner.
Right.
It's also what is often touted as the most evidence-based approach to therapy, and that's something that we can get into. But in many ways, it's because CBT actually lends itself to utilizing the scientific method. CBT is oftentimes short-term, not always, but oftentimes short-term, and it's very symptom-focused. So it's not uncommon that somebody comes in for a very classic example that I like to use is phobia or anxiety, like things on the anxiety spectrum of disorders. So if somebody comes in and they say, I'm really afraid to leave my house. I've been having a hard time coming out in public. And who knows how this pandemic is going to affect these kinds of things. A CBT therapist is going to work with you to schedule a certain number of sessions to start doing perhaps exposure therapy, figuring out how to get you to experience the things that you thought were going to have negative consequences, change some of the cognitive distortions that you had so that you understand that those behaviors and those cognitions don't need to be linked. It's very useful. It's very beneficial. It's also very manualized. So there are a lot of like CBT programs where it's like step by step by step. And that's why it's the most evidence-based, because if you're going to test something scientifically, you're going to use a medical model for that, right? It's just like testing a drug. You have to take it at these times. You have to do it in this dosage. And we're going to compare that to a placebo. So it's the most manualized type of psychology or type of therapy because it's very easy to test things that are done manualized.
Right.
There are two other main approaches, but there are a bunch of others that a lot of people would call integrative or eclectic or however you want to. And like integrative, I know is a scary word for us as skeptics, but I don't mean like integrative medicine. So the other main approach is psychodynamic psychotherapy, which some people may have heard of, they may not have. It's akin to psychoanalysis. It's sort of like modern psychoanalysis. There are still psychoanalysts out there, like the old school Freudian or Jungian psychoanalysts that do like analysis where they'll have a client come every day for multiple hours and do the thing on the couch. It's very rare. Only really rich people can even afford to do it. Like people with a lot of like neuroses and a lot of disposable income tend to do psychoanalysis. Not tend
Those
to,
things might be related too.
Exactly.
Like disposable income and
so,
neurosis.
yeah, like I have a professor who actually still does analysis in Boston. She works at Harvard. And like when you ask her like, who are your clients? She's like, rich men, basically. So like, okay, rich white men. But that is the modern type psychodynamic psychotherapy is a much more modernized version. So, people equate it with Freud. That's kind of unfair. There's actually a lot of evidence to support a lot of ideas of psychodynamic psychotherapy. A lot of it's about unconscious processing. A lot of it's about early attachment. So developmental rifts and repairs, ruptures, things like that, relational things, patterns of behavior that you tend to find a lot. A lot of people respond really well to that. I had a psychodynamic psychotherapist for 8 years and he was amazing. At the same time, there was a point where I was finally like, okay, I'm tired of talking about my childhood. Like that's not where my head is at anymore. I've processed a lot of that trauma and now I want to move on. And then the third option that my school offers, but again, like I said, there's some actual other third wave psychotherapy. So a lot of people talk about psychoanalysis first, because that was Freud and that was kind of like the foundation of psychology. Then they talk about behaviorism, Skinner, Watson, all that good stuff. And that's really where behaviorism came out of. And then from there, you had the cognitive psychology. So like the Aaron Becks of the world. And eventually that sort of merged into cog psych. So it wasn't just behaviors that we can measure. It was also thoughts, feelings, and introspection and working on those things together. And then there's a third wave. And that includes a lot of like feminist psychologies. It includes a lot of constructivist psychologies. And for me, existentialism is what I tend to really be drawn to. Sometimes people will refer to humanistic psychotherapy. My school actually offers the orientation is called existential humanistic. They might have even changed the name now to humanistic systems psychology, because systems theory is also another kind of more postmodern, and we can talk about why that's not a bad word, even though a lot of skeptics think it is.
Oh, I'd love to talk about. Hopefully, I'm making a note.
So anyway, long story short, I really am drawn to existential psychotherapy because it has a few tenets that really matter to me. That said, it's not terribly evidence-based. It doesn't mean it's ever been rejected. It doesn't mean that there's good evidence to show that it doesn't work. It's not a pseudoscience. Let's make that really clear. It's just that because it's so personalized to the individual, because the very tenets of what are true to existential psychotherapy exist, they don't lend themselves to being very testable. And that's kind of the problem. That said, there are core fundamental dynamics to psychotherapy that are testable. There are these like central tenets that a lot of people will describe. And those central tenets are found in all bona fide psychotherapy. So they're things like unconditional positive regard, empathy, um, non-judgmental stance, and these core things that really come down to the alliance between the therapist and the psychologist. Those are the most predictive of positive outcomes, and they underlie every bona fide approach. So the truth is, specific symptoms might lend themselves to different ways of getting therapy, but ultimately, so long as you and your therapist have a good relationship, so long as you're interested in positive beneficial change, therapy is by and large going to have positive outcomes, and there's a lot of good science to support that. Okay. So
Yeah.
that said, existentialism, it's based on existential philosophy. I mean, that's one of the easiest ways to put it. It's and yeah, Henry, I saw your question too. We'll get to that in a second. It's based on existential philosophy. It's one of the easiest ways to put it. And if you've ever studied existential philosophy, you know it's not pluralistic. So different existential therapists have different views of the world. Some of them are secular. Some of them are actually religious. Like, I think a good distinction can be made between somebody like now we're moving into the existential psychology world. So moving away from like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Heidegger and some of these kind of foundational, and like Sartre and some of these foundational existentialists, and moving forward to existential therapists. So people who had applied it to psychotherapy. Irvin Yalom
Mm.
and let's say Viktor Frankl are they're two really good examples of like different approaches that are kind of two sides of the same coin. So Yalom is secular. There's no higher power. There's no like in his personal world, and same with mine. I obviously have clients who believe in God, and it's important that I work within their frame, their worldviews.
Right.
But my personal belief is that there is no God. Yalom, same. And then you've got Frankl, who is, if you've read A Man's Search for Meaning, he's an Auschwitz survivor. He's a deeply religious Jewish man. And he believes that a lot of the things that got him through the concentration camps, they have to do with his faith in God. And one of the things that you'll find is that they both talk about meaning in very similar ways. The central difference that I've been able to pick up on is that whereas Viktor Frankl thinks that one of the major purposes in life is to uncover the inherent meaning that exists in the universe, Irvin Yalom believes that one of the central purposes in life is to create meaning, because there is no inherent meaning. And I can't ever remember if it's Hegel or Heidegger because I always mix them up. But there is a really great passage, and I'm totally going to butcher it, but it's talking about the absurdity of meaninglessness and the absurdity of the void and all of these very existential things, and because this approach is also very secular, and he says that the real absurdity of life is that there is no meaning, but the real beauty to it is that because there's no inherent meaning, we must act as artists to create it from nothing. And I think that's a really beautiful kind of approach.
One of the things that I wonder about, and this is a little bit not in my notes, and maybe we can just touch on this briefly,
Sure.
is the idea that like when we talk about creating our own meaning, it almost sounds like a parallel idea in ethics of like relativism, like meaning can be found anywhere and in anything. Do you feel like there are even though we all create our own meaning in slightly different ways, that there are common patterns of things that are meaningful?
Yeah, absolutely.
And versus somebody who says, like, I find my meaning in like destroying people's material possessions, like, or like breaking into homes, and like I find my meaning in harming children, or like, like there are some trends and patterns of things that people find meaningful.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, I'm really interested in death. So this is an area of research that I'm, dedicating my thesis. It's kind of where my dissertation, it's kind of where I ultimately might want to land. At least as of right now in my career path, I think I might be working with individuals, not in bereavement or grief therapy, but in working with individuals who are terminal. So who are facing their own death and processing some of those experiences. And when you read the death literature, which is in some ways robust and in other ways really sparse. And actually it is really heavily influenced by pastoral literature, right? Like
Right.
obviously the people who ultimately first started studying this and wanted to really understand it were the people who were doing last rites. They were the people, who is with somebody when they die. Oftentimes it's not a psychologist, it's a
Right.
priest,
Yeah.
or, whatever version it is in their religion. And so you really start to see a lot of trends, and we're talking across religions and secular approaches, so lack of religion, that there are, yes, core kind of central things that you see over and over. And some of them are culturally bound. Some of them are not. I do think that there are some central ethics that are kind of universal.
Mm-hmm.
Family is a big one. A lot of people talk about finding meaning in people that they love, affiliative, relational, interpersonal, meaning. I think in more Western and more individualist societies, you'll see people are drawing more meaning from their work. In collectivist societies, they might be drawing more meaning from community.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that love and, however you want to define that, maybe I should just say relationships, do tend to be one of the top things that people describe as being a source of meaning for them, and facilitating or being somehow involved in what they might consider a good death or an authentic death or even a dignified death, is to be
Mm-hmm.
surrounded by people who they care for, and or to have, even if all those people are gone, to have lived a life where they touched others deeply, and others touched them. So that's one of the kind of central things. But I think from an ethics, philosophy ethics perspective, I would label myself personally as a cultural contextualist. I'm not a cultural relativist, but I'm also not an absolutist. So that means that for me, I do think that there's certain cultures where the values are such that I will never understand them because of the culture that I came up with. And I think that some other cultural values are valid, even if it's very difficult for me to understand them because I'm constrained by my worldview. But I also think that there are foundational things that just because a culture promotes them are unethical, like female genital circumcision, for
Right.
example, or female genital mutilation, or, certain civil rights abuses. So I'm sort of somewhere in between those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's contextual, but there are still some fundamental human rights that I believe should exist throughout the world.
So one of the things, I'm a huge fan of Irvin Yalom, even though I'm not like an academic and not pursuing this in an academic way, the way you are. I have this book always with me, and it's like one of the, if those of you who don't know Irvin Yalom, grab Love's Executioner. It may sound like, I read this on the beach, let me just say that, in
Yeah.
Puerto Vallarta, one vacation years
And you weren't
ago.
crying your eyes out the whole time, right? You were
No, and I
okay.
wasn't like straining my brain to understand
Yeah.
some complicated philosophical ideas. It was so beautiful and moving, almost like reading a collection of short stories. It really is a collection of short stories. Can't recommend it enough. Love's Executioner and Other Tales of Psychotherapy by Irvin Yalom. And he, I think in my little bit of research to prepare for today, he's the one who sort of codified sort of these four main issues that everyone faces in their sort of existential life, which comes from our awareness of ourselves, right? Our consciousness and
Yeah.
our sense of being able to think about our thinking, and our awareness of our impending demise.
Yeah, he
Uh,
calls them existential givens. It's
Given,
like
yeah.
everybody's going to deal with these. And they're like,
So it's
and he
death.
ultimately thinks, and I do too, that these four things underlie not just everybody's experience, right? They're not just givens from an existential perspective, but they're also oftentimes the central seeds that for which people find themselves in therapy. So
Mm,
if somebody has a specific complaint, it's often a bunch of layers on top of this core existential given. And so being able to get down to these existential givens is really important, because a lot of times people are in flat out denial of all of them. But if you can, terror management theory is one approach where they
mm,
basically say that, like, if you can talk about these things, they focus mostly on death, which is one of the givens, but we'll get there. That if you can talk about these things, and if you can face them, and if you can hold them lightly, if you can be curious about them, if you can introspect in such a way that you're non-judgmental, but you allow these thoughts to float on through you, that there's actually going to be a massive psychological benefit to that.
So there, the four that he identifies, and I don't have them in front of me, but death, meaninglessness, isolation, and
my favorite one is the one you can't remember.
oh shoot, what is it?
Kind of the parallel or the push-pull or the paradox of freedom and responsibility.
Freedom, yeah, freedom,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
and he the oft quoted expression by, I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre, is that we're cursed to be free. Like, right?
Right.
The curse of being human is the curse of being free.
Yeah, and they talk, I mean, a lot of existentialists, these are main things that existential philosophers have grappled with in most of their writings. And I see it a lot in therapy clients, that one of the things that they're really struggling with is decision making. And it's because ultimately, in order to make a decision, you're also giving up all of the other options. And that's a really difficult thing for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah, you
It's
have
like,
to foreclose on all the other choices.
yeah. And so, there is this real push pull. Like, the more free you are, the more you give up responsibility. The more responsible you are, the more you give up freedoms. We see it in modern society in the privacy versus freedom, especially like in a more constitutional view. Argument. And the thing is that, this weird push pull, which is always ebbing and flowing, and you're always trying to find some sort of balance. It's not about going one way or the other way, because of course, if you go too far in any direction, too free, and you're rudderless and you're untethered. So now you don't have those important emotional relationships. Too responsible, and of course you have no spontaneity in your life, and you're lacking any semblance of creativity. Like, you're entrenched and you're really deep down. And yes, I think it's time for a philosophy joke.
Yes.
Where is it?
Hang on. Let me let him. Let's see, John Levin. Let me. Let's let him say his joke here.
And Henry, I promise I'm going to get back to you.
Yeah, we will, for sure. Because I have a friend, as I mentioned. I don't think the chat got through to all the participants, but I have a friend who practices ACT approach in his therapy practice, and
dude, I don't have the joke yet.
He doesn't. Never mind, John. Okay, thank you.
We'll get back to you.
We'll get back. Come up with.
We could take a second, because it'll be a little bit of a turn back to what we were talking about before. So, acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which really is kind of based on CBT principles. You also see it with DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and some more kind of modern CBT approaches. It's really funny because you're right. The question was, is it not an advance on CBT? But, it's not focused on eliminating symptoms, but rather playing 6 processes working towards psychological flexibility. So yes, it was actually like a really rudimentary characterization for me to say that all CBT is based on symptom reduction. It's not, but that's usually how treatment plans are modeled in the CBT approach. It's what are the symptoms? How can we reduce the symptoms? But there are more modern versions of CBT that actually in many ways approach third wave approaches. So there, when you look at ACT, or maybe actually DBT is a better example, and I'm just throwing out letters, and maybe this doesn't matter to you, you start to be like, that's really existential. Wait, we didn't do that in humanistic. And at a certain point, this is why a lot of people call themselves eclectic or integrative, because sticking with one approach doesn't always work for every client. Some people respond better to different approaches. Some people need more manual. I mean, I worked with girls in the foster care system, adolescent girls, and almost every girl that came in had some sort of, well, they didn't, but I ultimately gave them some sort of trauma diagnosis, and PTSD, reactive attachment, something along those lines, because almost every girl I saw lived through some horrible stuff when they were young. Severe sexual abuse, severe physical abuse, severe neglect. And there are some CBT approaches that I folded into my treatment for sure. We did some manualized stuff on becoming comfortable talking about traumatic experiences without reliving them, developing circles of trust, like very classic CBT, and sometimes ACT or DBT approaches. So a lot of people do fold those things in. I'm not an expert on ACT though, because that's not my orientation. So I haven't, I don't take all the classes that are CBT focused classes, and I haven't learned all the different treatment options. Also, a big difference between CBT and I think in some ways the ACT and the DBT that some people practice within cognitive behavioral therapy and existential therapy is that it's the case conceptualization part. I actually don't really look at symptoms, and I don't really diagnose my clients. I will diagnose for managed care purposes because I have to, because it's the only way that Medicare, for example, will pay for the therapy, or that somebody who's on private insurance will be able to get the therapy covered. But ultimately, I don't want to treat the symptom, and I don't want the person to be a constellation of symptoms to me. I want to treat the whole individual. This is a very humanistic approach, and I don't even really think of these issues that they're dealing with as pathology as much as I think of them as life circumstances and individual kind of esoteric and sometimes very universal core problems that have to do with, sort of the suffering of being human. And
Hmm.
so it goes to a bit of a deeper place. And that's why there are certain types of things. Like, I'm not going to be an eating disorder expert, for example. I can
Right.
work with somebody after they have gotten the crisis management part over with, and with some of the bigger life issues that they're dealing with, or for example, substance abuse. Maybe once somebody is in treatment and then they're in remission and they're able, they've been clean and sober for a while and they want to start tackling some of these deeper issues, great. But I'm probably not going to be the first line for somebody who is afraid that they're going to drink themselves to death tonight. I can do crisis intervention therapy, but I'm probably not going to do a manualized 12-week program that's going to help this person in a very structured way, not use. That's just not really what I'm studying, and it's not really
Yeah.
my approach to therapy.
I mean, I think this line of sort of discussion kind of leads into another question that I
Mhm.
had about the goals of any kind of therapy, really, but specifically the kind of work that you do. I think people, when they go to therapy, or at least when I've gone to therapy in the past, and I have multiple times, and I've
Mhm.
worked with a psychoanalyst in the past as well, not in an analytic format, but
Mhm.
like in a once a week type format. Um, and I think, roughly put, we go to therapy for the same reason we go to any doctor, which is to feel better.
Mhm.
Like there's
Exactly.
something troubling you, something upsetting you, and it's interfering with your life in some way, whether you can't sleep or your relationships don't work out, or something else. And so you go there to try to feel better. Um, is that similar, do you think, for existential? Like, or what is it? Because you said it's not about symptoms so much. So what would you say is like a good outcome, I guess, for someone who's seeking you out for help?
Right. So existential therapy is really interesting because you're right. People come to therapy because something's wrong, or because something's, interfering with, and the DSM defines a lot of these diagnoses as, having symptoms severe enough that they interfere with relationships, with your work, with your education, with your ability to care for yourself, whatever the case may be. Because ultimately, if we were to open up the DSM and point to something, would be like, I think I have that. And then you have to really go, oh, wait. Yes, I deal with this, but not to the extent that it's interfering with my life on a regular basis.
Right.
And that's I have a dimensional view of these diagnoses. I really think that we're trying to make things categorical that are dimensional. It's not the same as I have a UTI. I have a urinary tract infection. I can take a test. I can take an antibiotic. I can kill the urinary tract infection, and now it's gone. That's something that happens to me. That's where the medical model and the kind of psychotherapeutic model break down a little bit. Um, Existential therapists believe that people come to therapy because they're suffering. We might tend to use slightly more dramatic terms. And suffering can happen at any level, right? Suffering can be, I can't figure out if I want to leave my job to start this new one or if I should just stay here and it's keeping me up at night. Yeah, that can be
Totally.
suffering.
Yeah.
It can also be, I'm, just lost my mother and I can't get through the day without breaking down. Obviously, that's a more maybe obvious form of suffering to the outside world, but we're also not here to judge what is important to different people in their lives at different phases in their lives. So I do believe that people come to therapy because they're suffering. One of the big differences with the existential approach is that, and I think a chat just came in from Christine. That's going to be an important one for me. So one of the important and different things about the existential approach that we sometimes have to remember is that we don't necessarily think that just alleviating suffering for the sake of alleviating suffering is therapeutic. There's a certain percentage, or kind of subpopulation within the existential research and practitioner world who believe that suffering can be a major source of meaning, and that actually avoiding suffering at all costs is ultimately more damaging down the line. And so allowing yourself to fully experience suffering, but to do it in a safe way where you hold it somewhat lightly and where you explore it with curiosity, can actually lead to an ultimate lessening of that suffering. So it's more about like the acute versus the long term. I think a lot of people, they just need to feel better. And I get that. People who have crushingly debilitating depression, they might, and I'm one of those people, I really struggled when I was young and I needed the meds. It's like, it was the way to get me to a place where then I could start to really tackle these things in therapy. But
Definitely.
without the meds, I was so overwhelmed with it that I never even had a clear head, to be able to grapple with it. So yes, there are acute things that we do when we're dealing with crisis.
Yeah.
And then there are these more long-term things. But there is this real kind of existential view. And I think you see this fundamentally in almost all kind of existential, or the vast majority of existential philosophies, at least, that, you wouldn't know love if you didn't know loss, and life wouldn't be appreciated as much if we weren't all going to die and we didn't have that sense of impending death. That's really what makes our life in many ways worth living. There's this constant absurd and frustrating reality to existence, that is that in order to feel very deeply in one way that we might deem positive, we might label it that way, we often have to experience the equal and opposite feeling at some point. It's the only way we have those benchmarks. And
Yeah.
also some of it is cognitive restructuring, going back to that CBT thing. Some of it is really understanding the difference between fear and excitement, because, ultimately neurologically, they're the same thing.
Right.
Like, you have a sympathetic response, you have adrenaline. Like once you really understand what's going on in the body, it can help you understand that a lot of it is context, and a lot of it is the labels and the narratives that we've developed over our lives and our experiences as to how we make sense of what we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Christine Jones made a comment in the chat. It seems global humanity is currently experiencing an existential crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love for you to reflect on that. And then I have sort of a follow-up to that as well.
Yeah. So there are different, obviously, types of existential therapy. There are different people who ascribe to different views. There are different books that we read. And no, I don't think any one existential therapist is going to be the same. Um, but there is a fair amount of fundamental literature that actually basically makes the claim that the reason so many people feel so sick in the modern world is because the world is sick. That there are social pressures, that these very severe issues of systemic racism, and we're talking, not just overt, sometimes kind of covert, but also very painful experiences, as we have all been witnessing over the last several days. And we, ultimately have been experiencing our entire lives. That there are pressures, for example, on women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, gender identity minorities, orientation minorities, in order to act a certain way, to feel a certain way. Also, one of the big driving forces, I believe, is that we live in a capitalist, consumer-driven society, and it's not healthy. Like, we are obsessed with progress, we're obsessed with buying stuff, increasing our earning potential, hoarding things. The most popular television shows deal with the most superficial issues. And for some people it's escapism, but for other people it's a way to get caught up and well, it's escapism, which ultimately I believe is not healthy, because it allows you to just continue to avoid the big questions, which are, am I one day going to die? And am I prepared for the truth of that? Or I am one day going to die. Am I prepared for the truth of that? Where do I find meaning? What brings me joy? Have I ever had a truly existential experience? Like, have I ever felt depersonalization? Have I ever felt like I was somehow a part of everything and nothing at the same time? Or, some people might point to psychedelic experiences where they'll have these sort of profound existential things, but it's not uncommon for people to have them completely sober, lying under the stars at night, looking at the Milky Way, or reading a passage that really strikes them, or just, zoning off into space. And then the other things we talked about, freedom versus responsibility. A lot of people just don't want to think about it, so they just put that stuff on a shelf. What was the last one? See, now I'm lost. Meaning, death, freedom and responsibility. Oh, loneliness, of course. Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, isolation or loneliness.
Yeah, isolation, loneliness. These are deep things, and these are things that are fundamentally underlie very serious psychological issues. These are things people are grappling with often when they unfortunately die by suicide. These are things that people grapple with when they do seek out treatment, and these are things that people grapple with on an everyday level when they don't seek out treatment. And so, but ultimately, my view is that our society we don't live in like a Zen Buddhist society. Like, we know this. It doesn't promote any of the kind of stuff like the mindfulness, like the taking time to experience nature, like the slowing down and being really connected. And I think for some people, because of this pandemic, and not everybody has the same experience. Essential workers are still busting ass, and frontline workers are dealing with death on a level that it's hard for us to comprehend. But a lot of people are just stuck at home, and some of them are very busy, but for some people, the pace of their life has slowed, and they're able to not check things off the to-do list the way that they usually could, and they're not overwhelmed and distracted by all of their responsibilities. And that's when a lot of these existential issues start to creep in. That's what meditation is, guys. Like sitting there and trying to let your thoughts pass over you, but not become caught up in them. It's not about not thinking. It's about recognizing when you have thoughts and letting them flow by. There's a very classic study. I don't know if it's been reproduced, though. I love to cite it, but honestly, I would like to see it reproduced like 15 times, because then I feel better about citing it, where these researchers took people and they gave them a pretest. And the pretest just looked at how likely they are for self-harm. It was like a self-harm assessment. And most of the people in it were like very low on the self-harm assessment. It's like, I don't like hurting myself. And then they put them in an empty room with nothing to do for hours on end. And the only thing in the room was a little machine that when you would push it a certain way, it would shock you. And the vast majority of people would just sit there and hurt themselves when they were left alone in this room. And we can all sit here and talk about why does this happen? But I think one of the big takeaways for people who think more existentially was they would rather feel physical stimulation than be alone with their own thoughts, because that's a very frightening and if you haven't been practicing it, overwhelming prospect.
Yeah, and so we numb, so we don't have to worry about those thoughts. And sometimes you need to distract yourself and numb things, but as a general rule, it's also important to, engage with your humanity, and maybe ideally with someone else, either a therapist or a good friend, or casually, while you're numbing, maybe you could,
or yourself in silent contemplation and meditation.
That's right.
I mean, there's something really to be said about sitting, focusing on the breath and the body, really experiencing your physiology in a quiet and meaningful and kind of focused way, mindful way, and then allowing what comes up to come up naturally, not judging it, saying to yourself, that's curious and interesting that this thought keeps coming, and just watching it flow by. It's like you're sitting on the bank of the river. You're not in the rapids. The rapids are just flowing by and you're observing them. And the more you do that, there's actually very good evidence to show that your brain changes.
Mm.
There are certain pathways in your brain that are strengthened, and there's certain things that are suppressed. And the outcomes of this seem to be that there is more resiliency during
Mm.
times of trauma and great stress. And that's because in many ways, you're probably like kind of beefing up your ability to deal with those scary, difficult, existential thoughts.
Threats, yeah.
Yeah,
So
those threats,
you sort
exactly.
of I mean you made this amazing statement a minute ago that people are sick because the world is sick, and I think this is so crucial. And I this might be a little bit rambly, but I want to throw out a set
Yeah,
of ideas here related to that concept, and also um, sort of the question of positive psychology that's very popular
right,
right now. The notion of positive psychology, and for me, one of my chief criticisms of religion is exactly Karl Marx's criticism of religion, in that it often used to anesthetize people from dealing with reality. And it seems to me the existential approach to therapy, and many approaches to therapy, frankly, like my friend Brian, who has a clinical therapy practice, he's an LCSW.
hmm
um, you know, he's always saying, and every time I hear it, it's profound. It's one of those things I never get tired of hearing. It seems profound every time I hear it, that it's not about um, stopping what we're feeling, but learning to like move through those feelings, or
yeah,
live with them. In other words, life is never going to be without suffering, but we learn to manage that suffering or accept it to a degree. But I also sometimes worry that the positive psychology movement is designed in such a way as to anesthetize people to the real fundamental underlying problems. In other words, that people are not experiencing suffering because they've got the wrong idea about something, but because the world is actually full of suffering, and
yeah.
that we should rise up and change that world, not just learn to be more zen about it. You know what I mean? And I wondered, in your intersection with social justice, and you mentioned a minute ago, some of the things, and we've just obviously seen in the last 3 or 4 days tragic examples of the brokenness that we're talking about. It's not just a matter of folks, in Minneapolis saying like, I just need to get my head right about this. It's like, no, cops need to stop killing innocent
Right.
people. So how does this positive psychology and sort of the wellness desire that we all have as humanists to be well and to spread wellness relate to your impulse to also see the world fundamentally change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to approach that question. The first one is to take the idea of positive psychology and kind of unpack it. I think, unfortunately, positive psychology, as Seligman first intended it to be practiced or understood or researched, has been bastardized. So there's the traditional kernels of what positive psychology was supposed to teach, and then there's like the power of positive thinking movement, which has really been co-opted by like The
Mm.
Secret and by like this idea that if I just will something into existence, or if I just keep thinking positively, then things will get better. And ultimately, of course, we know that not only does that not work, but it actually leads to a lot of victim blaming. It oftentimes leads to greater suffering because you're setting yourself up for failure. I
Mm.
Early on in my career, when I was working at the Huffington Post, writing, a science or doing a science video series, I interviewed an oncologist who was really outspoken against this like power positive thinking movement. And he was saying it's effed up. Like, it's really effed up that dying people are treated as survivors when they quote beat cancer, and as victims when they can't beat it, as if there's anything they could have done about it,
Right.
as if they were doing anything at all. It's like that was the
Somehow they did it wrong.
doctors.
Yeah.
No, it was like the doctors were doing the treatments that they thought and that were appropriate, and the cancer either ended their lives or it didn't. Like, that's just the luck of the draw. And I think for a lot of people, the idea that things could happen so randomly, and this is an aside, is a very difficult thing for people. This is one of the many reasons that we see conspiratorial thinking crop up.
Hmm.
This is the reason I think that President Trump takes hydroxychloroquine. It's not the only reason. It's also because, many reasons.
Many reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, because he can't be wrong, and he's a narcissist, and he's going to double down and blah, blah, blah. And there's a million cognitive biases there. But one of the other reasons is that the idea that random suffering and terror could be so rampant in the
Mm,
world is too much to bear for a lot of people. They need a sense of control. They need a
control.
sense of organization. They need a sense of, if I do this, it will lead to this, and at least I'm doing something, even if that's something we know doesn't have any beneficial outcome. And there's a better place you can be putting your effort.
Mm,
It's why people seek out pseudoscientific crank cures. It's why people think that they have to maintain a positive face when they're coping with death. And sadly, it can backfire. And that
mm,
doesn't mean I'm saying you shouldn't be happy, and it doesn't mean I'm saying you shouldn't be positive when the situation calls for it and when you want to be positive, and if that's your disposition. But this movement towards only being positive in the face of everything, yeah, it's effed up. And it's actually not what positive psychology is about. Positive psychology is more about finding meaning. It's actually a humanistic view.
mhm,
It came out of humanistic practice. It's about finding meaning, but it's about focusing on strengths.
mm,
And I use that in my practice all the time. When I have somebody who comes in who's really suffering and who actually has a lot of limitations, like I said, because they've been dealing with trauma, so they might have cognitive limitations, or they might have really poor attachment styles and some antisocial tendencies and stuff. I try to find what they do well, and I try to find where they have insights, and
mm,
instead of constantly trying to fix the stuff that society deems as broken, it's about focusing on the stuff that they're doing well, that they're doing right, that can be a tool for them, that can help them, and eventually helping that to grow and grow and grow and continue to facilitate in these other areas. So that's really all positive psychology was supposed to be.
mm.
um, anyway, but moving beyond that, you were talking about, the big question had to do with
Well,
tip
just
of my tongue.
just like the desire for feeling, and I've experienced this in my own self. Like I, I want to feel the pain of the world because I feel
Right,
like it keeps me grounded. And if I didn't feel outraged about, you know,
right,
thing, it's like the pain that I feel, it's almost like pushing that button and getting the shock to know that I'm alive. It's like if I saw, you know, black people being gunned down by cops indiscriminately and didn't feel anything, I would worry. But I also know that I need a certain baseline of mental calm to be a healthy human being. I need to be able to sleep at night. I need to eat regularly. And if I'm not doing those things, then I'm perhaps over invested in, like, or externalizing myself in a way that's not healthy. But I
right.
guess I think people need to go to yoga, but they also need to organize, I guess is
Yeah,
what.
so there is a process, and it's been attributed and utilized, and there are special names for it, and a bunch of different researchers have worked out their own little schematic of it. But I'm gonna get away from any specific terminology and just talk about this developmental process that a lot of researchers have pointed to, and maybe we'll use race as a scaffolding, as an example in this case. So very few people, nobody is born racist, right? We know this. So racism is something that's taught, and it can be unlearned. And let's say that we're talking about the journey from waking up in the world. Let's say you were raised in a racist family, and you're talking about the journey from waking up to the world, seeing inequity, seeing corruption, seeing violence, and realizing that there's something very, very wrong, and ultimately getting to the point where you are doing activist work. A lot of stuff has to happen in between. And the way that that stuff happens is often a function of privilege. And so early on, you might be more insulated. The things that are existing might not be happening to you, and you might not even be aware that they're happening because of your privilege. And so they might not feel as relevant to you. And that's a way to stay very secure and insulated in your either racist tendencies, or even, let's say, neutral, non-racist tendencies, but you haven't quite made it to an anti-racist stance yet. And sometimes that has to do with being exposed to a lot of these things. And obviously, one of the best ways to expand your mind is to surround yourself with people who are different from you. It's to travel, it's to read the news, it's to read all opposing points of view. And the more you do that, obviously, it's going to be very hard not to be exposed to this kind of stuff. And then eventually you're going to get to a point where the exposure, at first you're outraged. At first you're like, I can't believe this is happening. Well, that's a very privileged perspective. And it's okay if that's where you're at right now, that you're, you know, watching these videos online or you're hearing about and you're like, I cannot believe this is happening. You know, a lot of people can believe it because they've been living it their whole lives. And they're like, of course I can believe it. Wake up, white lady. So, you know, you're going to go from these stages of, I can't believe it to feeling, kind of like exhausted by it or like super depressed by it. And there are
Yeah.
all these different ways that we can slice and dice these kind of developmental experiences. But the thing that I think is important to remember is that you have to have a sense of the fact that this is unjust.
Mm.
And you have to really understand why it's unjust before you're going to take up any sort of activist cause. And for a lot of the people that you don't see, it's like they haven't made it that far yet. And it's probably because of complacency, to be honest. It's probably because they're in denial, their eyes are closed, they're not open to alternative points of view, they're not reading the news, they're not, you know, watching the news stories, they're not taking the time to read the books. It takes effort. It's very easy to like stay in your little bubble and to stay very secure and to just ignore anything that's outside of your worldview. It's becoming increasingly more difficult. But there's a developmental experience that happens, and you're kind of probably not going to become an activist if you're still grappling with the fact that this stuff is actually real and you're still struggling with the really conflicting and overwhelming emotions that come along with waking up to the fact that this is happening in the world. And so I think for different people, they're at different stages of that process.
Yeah.
You know, and some people do yoga because it's like the trendy thing to do. Some people do yoga to get fit. And some people meditate because, you know, X, Y, and Z. But I do think that you will start to see some correlations between people who are deeply mindful and who are really taking that kind of time to, quote, zen out, and the amount of time that they spend in that suffering headspace, whether it's watching documentaries or reading books or going out and marching or dedicating, contributing financially. But I do think that oftentimes the reason that we need to do deep introspection is because the world is suffering. And the more we allow ourselves to be exposed to that, which is actually healthy, the more that we have to, in many ways, counterbalance that with self-care.
Yeah, it's like a dialectic, I think, where
Yeah.
you kind of go inward and take care of yourself, and then you can look outward and notice the world and begin to see where, the classic community organizing basic training, which is like the way the world is and the way the world ought to be, and noticing that difference and beginning to ask yourself, like, why is that way? Thanks so
Right.
much. Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
great to
And
see your
thanks
face.
everybody for
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite a few people still hanging in there.